The pie sat untouched. Cade Blackwood had made his decision before the desperate widow even finished speaking. One look at her body was enough. He sent her away into the cold Montana morning, back to the 12-mile walk she'd come from. But what he didn't know was that this woman he'd just rejected would soon become the only thing standing between him and the most dangerous man in the territory. This is the story of how a single act of cruelty became an act of redemption. The pie sat untouched on Cade Blackwood's desk, still warm from the oven. Steam curled up from the latticed crust, carrying the scent of cinnamon and apples through the sparse office. Outside the window, a woman's broad figure moved slowly across the ranch yard, one hand gripping the small hand of a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. They walked with the careful dignity of people who knew they were being watched, who understood that every step was a test. Cade didn't move toward the pie. He sat motionless behind his desk, his weathered hands flat on the scarred wood, his jaw set in a hard line. One look at Sarah Bennett's body had been enough. One look at the way her dress strained across her middle, at the soft roundness of her face, at everything about her that spoke of softness in a world that demanded hardness. He'd made his decision before she'd even finished her nervous introduction. The door creaked open without a knock. Marcus Holt stood in the frame, 50 years old and silver at the temples, his foreman's authority evident in the way he held himself. But there was something else in his stance now. Something like disappointment. "Boss." Marcus's voice stayed carefully neutral. "She walked 12 miles to get here. The boy looks like he hasn't had a decent meal in weeks." Cade kept his eyes on the papers before him, though he wasn't reading anymore. "I told everyone, no more hiring, especially not widows with children. Maybe this one's different." "They're never different, Holt." His voice turned cold final. "They come here desperate. They need saving. And I'm not in the business of saving people anymore." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Through the window they could both see Sarah Bennett reaching the ranch gate, pausing to adjust the boy's coat even though the March wind was mild. A mother's automatic gesture. Protective. Tender. "You used to be," Marcus said softly. Cade's hands curled into fists. "Get back to work." Marcus held his ground for 3 more seconds, a small rebellion, then turned and left. The door closed with a click that sounded too loud in the silent office. Alone again, Cade let his eyes drift to the pie. The scent was overwhelming now, filling every corner of the room, stirring memories he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. Ellen had made apple pie every Sunday. Their daughter Lucy had always stolen the first bite, her small face lighting up with joy. The kitchen had been warm and full of laughter, full of life. Then he'd left for the war, and when he came home the kitchen was empty. The house was empty. Ellen and Lucy were in the ground, victims of a diphtheria outbreak that had swept through while he was gone, fighting someone else's battles, protecting someone else's family, while his own died alone. He stood abruptly, grabbed the pie, and carried it to the window. For a moment he considered throwing it out, watching it smash on the ground below. Instead, he set it on the sill and turned his back on it, on the woman who'd made it, on the whole mess of human need and hope that he wanted no part of. His ranch was the largest in Montana Territory. 5,000 acres of good grazing land, 100 head of cattle, 15 men on the payroll. He'd built it through hard work and harder decisions, and he ran it with an iron hand because that was the only way to survive out here. Softness got you killed. Charity got you taken advantage of. He'd learned those lessons the brutal way. Cade Blackwood was done being soft. But 12 hours earlier, in a different part of Silver Creek, softness was all Sarah Bennett had left. She stood outside Mayor Victor Reed's office for the 3rd time that week, clutching an envelope that contained everything she owned in the world. $3.50. Not enough to buy food for more than a few days. Nowhere near enough to pay what Reed claimed she owed. The door opened and Reed himself appeared, impeccably dressed in a dark suit that probably cost more than Sarah's entire cabin. His smile was practiced sympathetic, the smile of a man who'd perfected the art of appearing kind while slowly tightening the noose. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice smooth as creek water, "please come in." Sarah stepped into the office, acutely aware of how out of place she looked. Her dress was clean but old-mended in 3 places. Her hands were red and rough from washing other people's laundry. Everything about her screamed poverty, and from the way Reed's eyes swept over her, she knew he saw it, knew he was counting it as leverage. "I'm sorry to bother you again, Mayor Reed," Sarah said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "My son was sick last week. I couldn't work for 2 days, but I can pay something now, and I promise the rest by next month." Reed settled into his leather chair with the ease of a man who'd sat in judgment over others 1,000 times before. "Mrs. Bennett, we've had this conversation. The loan your husband took out has been overdue for 3 months now. I've been more than patient." "My husband died 6 months ago," Sarah said, and hated how her voice cracked on the word died. "He was working for your lumber company when the accident happened. You said you'd help the families of men who were killed on the job." "And I have helped," Reed said, spreading his hands in a gesture of false generosity. "I gave you a 3-month grace period on the loan payments. But grace periods end, Mrs. Bennett. Business is business. If you can't pay the full amount, $1,500, within 7 days, I'll have no choice but to foreclose on your property." The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. 1,500. But the original loan was only 500. We'd already paid back 300 before David died. Reed pulled a document from his desk drawer with the practiced ease of a man who'd done this many times before. "The contract your husband signed includes a clause about accelerated payment in the event of the borrower's death. It's quite standard. The remaining balance becomes immediately due plus penalties. Penalties that equal 3 times the original loan." Sarah's hands trembled as she took the paper. The words swam before her eyes. There in print so small she had to squint to read it was the clause. Hidden in the margin, barely visible, a single sentence that destroyed everything. "Your husband signed it," Reed said. "Voluntarily. I'm sorry, but the law is the law." Sarah looked up at him, at his smooth face and sympathetic eyes, and saw the truth beneath the mask. He wasn't sorry. He was counting money in his head. Her land, her home, the tiny plot where her son had been born and where her husband was buried. Reed was already calculating what he could get for it. "Please," she said, and hated herself for begging. "Give me more time. I'll work. I'll do anything." Reed's smile widened slightly. "There might be one option. My wife is looking for domestic help. It wouldn't pay much, perhaps $10 a month, but it would be steady work." $10 a month. It would take her years to pay off $1,500 at that rate, and she'd be working in Rachel Reed's household, subject to the woman's cruelty, her constant comments, her enjoyment of having someone beneath her to torment. Sarah stood. "Thank you for your time, Mayor Reed. I'll find another way." She walked out before the tears could fall, before he could see her break. Outside, Tommy was waiting where she'd left him, sitting on the wooden steps, drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick. He looked up as she emerged, his young face already too serious, already too aware that something was wrong. "Mama," he said, "did he give us more time?" Sarah knelt down and pulled her son close, breathing in the scent of him, little boy sweat, and the soap she'd used to scrub his hair that morning. "No, baby, but we'll figure something out. We always do." It was a lie, and they both knew it. But sometimes lies were all you had to hold back the darkness. That evening, Sarah stood in her tiny kitchen and made a decision. She'd baked her last good pie with the last of her sugar and butter ingredients she couldn't afford but had saved for weeks. Tomorrow, she'd take it to Blackwood Ranch. Marcus Holt had been kind to her once years ago when David was still alive. Maybe he'd remember. Maybe he'd convince his boss to give her a chance. It was a desperate plan. But desperation was all she had left. The next morning she walked 12 miles with Tommy at her side, the pie wrapped carefully in cloth to keep it warm. By the time they reached Blackwood Ranch, her feet ached and her son was stumbling with exhaustion. But she kept her back straight and her head high as she approached the main house. Marcus Holt met her at the door, his weathered face breaking into a smile of recognition. "Mrs. Bennett, been a long time." "Mr. Holt," Sarah said, I'm looking for work. I can cook, clean, do accounts, whatever Mr. Blackwood needs." Marcus's smile faded. "Boss isn't hiring right now, ma'am. Especially not for the house. He's been clear about that." "Please," Sarah said, and held out the pie. "Just let me show him what I can do." Marcus looked at the pie, then at Sarah's face, then at the boy who was trying so hard not to show how tired he was. Something shifted in his expression. "Wait here." He took the pie and disappeared into the house. Sarah and Tommy stood on the porch for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes. When Marcus returned, his face was carefully blank. "Boss said no, ma'am. I'm sorry. Here's your pie back." Sarah took the still warm dish and felt something inside her crack. She'd walked 12 miles. She'd used her last good ingredients. She'd swallowed her pride and begged. And Cade Blackwood hadn't even tasted it before deciding she wasn't worth his time. "Thank you for trying," she managed to say. She and Tommy walked back toward the gate, moving slowly, neither of them speaking. Behind them in his office window, Cade Blackwood watched them go and told himself he felt nothing at all. But that evening, as the sun set over the ranch and the cowboys gathered for their usual terrible dinner, Marcus Holt made a decision of his own. He found Cade in the barn, checking on a mare that was due to foal. The boss stood with one hand on the horse's flank, his face in shadow. "That pie," Marcus said without preamble. "I tried it." Cade didn't look up. "I told you to give it back." "I did, but I tried it first." Marcus paused. "Boss, it was the best apple pie I've had in 20 years. Better than what we get at the church socials. Better than anything since your wife used to cook." Cade's hand stilled on the mare's side. "Don't." "Mrs. Bennett is desperate. Her husband died working for Victor Reed's lumber company. Reed's trying to foreclose on her property. She's got a young son and nowhere to go." Marcus took a breath. "We need a cook. The men complain about the food every single day. You know they do. We can make do. We've been making do for 3 years. Ever since Ellen died, this place has felt like a prison. The men eat slop, nobody smiles, and you hide in your office like you're already dead." Marcus's voice was hard now. "That woman walked 12 miles with a boy who's half-starved. She made you a pie that would make angels weep. And you sent her away because looking at her reminded you that people still need things, that life still happens." Cade turned his face dark with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know you made Ellen a promise," Marcus said. "Before you left for the war. I was there. I heard her make you swear that if something happened to her you wouldn't stop living. Ellen and Lucy are dead because I left them." Cade's voice was raw. "I went to fight for the Union and they died of a disease I could have prevented if I'd been here, if I'd gotten them to a doctor in time. So don't you dare throw Ellen's words at me. She didn't die because of you. She died because the world is cruel and random, and sometimes terrible things happen." Marcus stepped closer. "But what you're doing now, this half-life you're living, this is a choice, and it's the wrong one." Cade wanted to hit him, wanted to roar and rage and throw Marcus out. But the foreman had been his friend for 15 years, had fought beside him in the war, had helped him bury his wife and daughter. Marcus had earned the right to speak truth, even when that truth felt like a knife in the gut. "What do you want me to do?" Cade asked, exhausted. "Tomorrow morning, 5 o'clock, I'm going to tell Mrs. Bennett to come cook breakfast for the men. She won't know you didn't order it. The cowboys will eat her food, and if they like it, you hire her. If they don't, she leaves. Fair." It wasn't fair at all. It was manipulation, and Cade knew it. But he also knew that Marcus was right about one thing. The men did deserve better food, and if Sarah Bennett could actually cook as well as that pie suggested, maybe it would solve one problem at least. "Fine," Cade said, "but I don't want to see her, and she stays in the guest cabin away from the main house. This is a business arrangement. Nothing more." Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Nothing more. That night Marcus rode into town and found Sarah Bennett's cabin at the edge of Silver Creek. It was small and sad with gaps in the walls where the wind whistled through. He knocked gently, not wanting to startle anyone. Sarah opened the door, her face haggard from crying. Behind her, Tommy lay curled on a narrow bed, already asleep. "Mr. Holt," she said, surprised. "Is something wrong?" "Wrong? No, ma'am. Something's right." Marcus pulled off his hat. "Boss changed his mind. He wants you to come cook breakfast for the men tomorrow morning, 5 o'clock sharp. You do a good job, you've got a position. $30 a month, room and board included." Sarah stared at him, not daring to believe. "He changed his mind." "Tried that pie after you left," Marcus lied smoothly. "Said it was too good to pass up. Needed to see if you could cook more than dessert." "I can," Sarah said immediately. "I can cook anything. I won't disappoint him." 5 o'clock then. Bring the boy. We'll find him a corner to sleep in while you work." Marcus replaced his hat. "And Mrs. Bennett, don't be late. Boss doesn't like waiting." Sarah nodded, already mentally inventorying what ingredients she had left, what she could make to impress a ranch full of hungry cowboys. "I'll be there. Thank you, Mr. Holt. Thank you so much." After Marcus left, Sarah stood in her tiny kitchen and let herself cry properly for the first time in months. Not tears of despair this time, but of desperate, fragile hope. Maybe, just maybe, she and Tommy would be all right. At 4 in the morning, Sarah woke her son gently. They dressed in the dark, gathered the last of her cooking supplies into a basket, and walked the 12 miles back to Blackwood Ranch. The March air was cold and damp, the stars still bright overhead. By the time they reached the ranch, Tommy was exhausted, stumbling on his feet. Marcus met them at the kitchen door. "Right on time. Good. Kitchen's through here." The kitchen was larger than Sarah's entire cabin, with a massive cast-iron stove and shelves lined with supplies. Her heart leaped. Real flour, sugar, eggs, butter, salt pork and bacon. More food than she'd seen in one place in months. "Make breakfast for 15 men, Marcus said. "They'll be here at 6. Whatever you think they'll like." Sarah tied on her apron and got to work. Tommy curled up in a corner on a pile of empty feed sacks, asleep, before his head hit the burlap. And Sarah cooked with a fierce, focused intensity, pouring everything she had into the meal. Bacon fried crisp with a touch of honey. Scrambled eggs made fluffy with fresh cream. Biscuits that rose high and golden split and filled with melting butter. And because she had the ingredients and the time, she made a small apple pie using the last of the apples from her own trees back home. At 6 o'clock precisely, 15 cowboys tramped into the dining hall, tired and grumbling after the night watch. They sat down at the long wooden table expecting the usual watery porridge and burnt coffee. Instead, Sarah brought out platters of food that made them fall silent in awe. The first man to take a bite of bacon actually closed his eyes. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. Another tried the eggs and looked up at Sarah with something like reverence. "Ma'am, where'd you come from?" A young cowboy named Henry Nash, who couldn't have been more than 25, bit into a biscuit and made a sound that was almost a sob. "I thought bacon was supposed to be black and chewy. I thought this was just how food was." Laughter rippled around the table, but it was warm, surprised laughter. The men ate like they'd never eaten before, going back for seconds and thirds, cleaning their plates so thoroughly they barely needed washing. Sarah stood by the stove, her hands clasped nervously, watching them. This was her test. This was everything. The door to the hall opened, and Cade Blackwood walked in, intending to grab coffee and leave. But he smelled the food first, that scent of bacon and fresh bread and something sweet baking. It stopped him in his tracks. He looked at the table, at his men who for the first time in 3 years weren't complaining or rushing through their meal. They were eating slowly, savoring, actually talking and laughing. Marcus appeared at his elbow. "Boss, this is Mrs. Bennett. She cooked breakfast." Cade's eyes found Sarah standing by the stove with flour on her hands and her face flushed from the heat. She was watching him with barely concealed anxiety, waiting for judgment. "You cooked all this in an hour?" Cade asked, his voice harder than he intended. "Yes, sir," Sarah said. "Can you cook for larger numbers? This isn't a family kitchen." "I've cooked for 30 people at church gatherings, sir. I can manage 15. Cade was silent, thinking. Around him his cowboys were devouring the food, clearly hoping he'd say yes, that this wasn't just a one-time miracle. "All right," he said finally. "Trial period. 1 week. $30 a month room and board. You're responsible for 3 meals a day for 15 men. You cook, you clean up after yourself, and you stay out of my way. If anyone complains about the food, you're gone. Understood?" Sarah's face transformed with relief. "Understood, sir. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. You won't regret this." Cade didn't respond. He poured himself coffee, turned, and walked out without tasting any of the food she'd made. But Marcus noticed that the boss didn't dump the coffee after the first sip like he usually did. And when Cade thought no one was looking, he'd taken a single biscuit, wrapped it in a cloth, and carried it with him. Sarah Bennett had just won her first battle. But neither she nor Cade knew that Victor Reed was watching from town, calculating, already planning his next move. Because Reed hadn't become the richest man in Silver Creek by letting his prey escape. Sarah worked through that first day in a blur of activity. After breakfast, she cleaned the kitchen, inventoried supplies, planned lunch. Marcus showed her the small cabin behind the barn where she and Tommy would stay. It was simple, one room with a wooden bed, a small table, a stove. But it was clean and solid, with a roof that didn't leak and walls that kept out the wind. Tommy woke up in the afternoon and explored the ranch with the cautious wonder of a child who'd learned not to expect good things. Cowboy smiled at him, ruffled his hair. One old hand named Dutch showed him how to braid rope. For the first time in 6 months, Tommy laughed. Sarah heard it through the kitchen window and had to stop working for a moment, overcome. Her son was happy. They were safe. It wasn't forever, just a week's trial, but it was more than they'd had yesterday. Lunch was beef stew, thick with vegetables, and tender meat served with fresh bread. The Cowboys praised it so loudly that Sarah blushed. Dinner was roasted chicken with potatoes, apple cobbler for dessert. By the end of the day, the men were talking about her cooking like it was something mythical, something they'd tell their grandchildren about. Cade ate all 3 meals in his office alone. Marcus brought him plates and noted that the boss ate everything, even though he never commented on it. On the 3rd day, Tommy made a mistake. He was playing near the barn, drawing pictures in the dirt with a stick, when Cade's half-wild stallion spooked at something. The horse reared, hooves flashing. Tommy was too close. Cade was there in an instant, moving faster than Marcus had seen him move in years. He grabbed Tommy and pulled him back, then calmed the horse with a firm hand and low voice. The danger passed in seconds. But when Cade looked down at the boy in his arms, something in his face cracked open. Tommy was 8 years old, brown-haired, serious-eyed, the same age Lucy had been. "What were you doing near the barn?" Cade's voice came out harsher than he intended. "This is a working ranch. It's dangerous. You can't just play wherever you want." Tommy stared up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to." Sarah came running, alerted by the commotion. She saw Cade holding her son, saw Tommy's tear-streaked face. "Tommy, are you hurt?" "No, Mama. The horse scared me, but Mr. Blackwood saved me." Sarah pulled Tommy into her arms, her heart hammering. Then she looked up at Cade. "Thank you. I'm so sorry. I should have been watching him." "You were working." "I expect you to work." Cade's voice was still hard, but something underneath was softer. "But the boy needs to stay away from the barn and the horses. If he can't, you'll both have to leave." "He'll stay away," Sarah promised. "Won't you, Tommy?" Tommy nodded vigorously, still pressed against his mother. Cade looked at them for another moment, this woman and her son holding each other in the dust of his ranch yard. Then he turned and walked away without another word. But that night, Marcus found him standing outside the barn, staring at nothing, his face haunted. "You all right, boss?" "He's the same age she was," Cade said quietly. "Lucy, when she died, 8 years old." Marcus said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only kindness available. "I grabbed him without thinking," Cade continued. "Just reacted, and for a second I felt it again, that need to protect, to keep someone safe. I haven't felt that in 3 years. Maybe that's a good thing. Or maybe it's just going to hurt worse when they leave." Cade's hands clenched. "Everyone leaves Holt, one way or another." "Not everyone. I'm still here." Cade almost smiled. Almost. You're too stubborn to leave. Damn right. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. Mrs. Bennet made pot roast for dinner. You should try some while it's still warm. I'll eat in my office. Of course you will. But Marcus's voice was fond patient. He'd wait. Cade would come around eventually. He had to, because Marcus had seen something the boss hadn't yet noticed. The way Cade's shoulders had relaxed slightly over the past 3 days. The way he'd stopped drinking whiskey every night. The way he'd started checking on the horses again, walking the property, engaging with the work instead of just enduring it. Sarah Bennet and her son were breathing life back into Blackwood Ranch, whether Cade wanted to admit it or not. On Saturday of that first week, Sarah had to go into town for supplies. Marcus offered to accompany her, sensing she'd need moral support. They rode in the ranch wagon, Tommy between them, excited to see civilization again. Silver Creek was small, dusty, built around a single main street. The general store stood at one end, the church at the other, with the bank saloon and assorted shops in between. Everyone knew everyone else's business, which meant everyone had already heard that Sarah Bennet was working at Blackwood Ranch. The general store owner, Mr. Henderson, greeted her with cautious politeness. "Mrs. Bennet, heard you found employment." "Yes, sir, at Blackwood Ranch. I need supplies for the week's cooking." Henderson gathered the items she listed while Sarah felt eyes on her from every corner of the store. Women whispered behind their hands. Men's gazes lingered a bit too long, assessing, judging. Then the door opened and Rachel Reed swept in, followed by 2 other society women. Rachel was Victor Reed's wife, 38 years old, and beautiful in a cold, sharp-edged way. She ran the ladies' society with an iron fist and had made Sarah's life miserable before David's death. Since becoming a widow, Sarah had been completely shut out. "Oh my," Rachel said loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Sarah Bennet, I heard you'd found work at Cade Blackwood's ranch. How very fortunate for you." The tone made it clear that fortune had nothing to do with it. Sarah kept her eyes on Henderson's hands as he wrapped her purchases. "I'm his cook, Mrs. Reed. It's honest work." "Of course it is." Rachel moved closer, her perfume cloying in the close air. "But people are talking, you understand. A widow living on a ranch with a wealthy, unmarried man. It does raise questions about propriety. I have my own cabin. I work in the kitchen. There's nothing improper." "I'm sure there isn't." Rachel's smile was knife-sharp. "But appearances matter in a community like ours. And the appearance is that you've taken advantage of a vulnerable man's loneliness, that you've used your situation to manipulate him into giving you shelter." Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her purchases. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, to tell Rachel exactly what she thought of her and her poisoned tongue. But she couldn't. She needed this job. She needed to keep her head down and survive. "I haven't manipulated anyone," she said quietly. "Mr. Blackwood hired me because I can cook. That's all." Rachel turned to her companions. "What do you think, ladies? Should we believe her?" "She did make quite a spectacle of herself," one woman said. "Taking pies to every ranch in the county looking for work." "Desperate behavior," the other agreed. "The kind of thing a woman does when she's looking for more than just employment." Marcus had been standing by the door letting Sarah handle this herself. But his patience ran out. "Mrs. Reed, I suggest you mind your own business. Mrs. Bennet is a respectable woman doing respectable work. If you have concerns, you can bring them directly to Mr. Blackwood." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Holt, how protective you are. Does your boss know you're defending his cook's honor in public?" "My boss knows I don't tolerate gossip or slander, and neither should you as a Christian woman." Rachel's face flushed with anger, but she was too well-bred to make more of a scene. "Come, ladies. I believe we have better places to be." They swept out in a rustle of skirts, leaving silence behind. Sarah paid Henderson with hands that shook. Outside in the wagon, she finally let herself breathe. Tommy climbed into her lap, sensing her distress, and she held him tight. "They're just scared," Marcus said as he guided the horses out of town. "Scared that if someone like you can find work and safety, it means they're not as special as they thought." Rachel Reed especially. She built her whole identity on being better than everyone else. She's right, though, Sarah said miserably. People will talk. They'll assume things. Mr. Blackwood will hear it and decide I'm more trouble than I'm worth. Boss doesn't care what people think. Everyone cares what people think. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said, "Let me tell you something about Cade Blackwood. When his wife and daughter died, half the county turned out for the funeral. Everyone wanted to offer sympathy to help. But most of them were really just curious, wanted to see how he'd react, wanted the gossip." Sarah listened, holding Tommy close. "Cade shut them all out, sent them away. He doesn't attend church, doesn't go to town unless absolutely necessary, doesn't let people close enough to hurt him. He's built walls so high nobody can climb them." Marcus glanced at her. "But here's the thing. Those walls aren't because he doesn't care. They're because he cares too much. He loved his family so deeply that losing them nearly killed him. So when people like Rachel Reed spread their poison, Cade won't hear it, because he stopped listening to people 3 years ago." "I hope you're right," Sarah said softly. But that night, lying in her cabin, she worried. She'd been at the ranch less than a week, and already the gossip was starting. How long before it reached Cade's ears? How long before he decided she wasn't worth the trouble? She couldn't let that happen. Couldn't let Tommy lose this safety, this happiness, which meant she had to be perfect, had to work harder, be quieter, take up less space, had to make herself indispensable before they could drive her away. Sunday morning came bright and cold. Sarah was up at 4:30 as usual, starting breakfast preparations. The Cowboys had requested her apple pie again, so she'd risen even earlier to get the pastry ready. She was pulling the pie from the oven when the kitchen door opened. Cade Blackwood stood there silhouetted in the early light. This was the first time he'd come to the kitchen since hiring her. "Mr. Blackwood," Sarah said, startled. "Is something wrong? The men tell me you've been working 18-hour days." His voice was flat, unreadable. "That's not sustainable." "I can manage, sir. I want to make sure everything is perfect." "Nothing needs to be perfect. It just needs to be good." He moved into the kitchen, his presence making the large space feel suddenly small. "You're working yourself to exhaustion. That helps no one." Sarah set down the pie, wiping her hands on her apron. "With respect, sir, I need this job. I need to prove I'm worth keeping." "You've already proven that. The men haven't complained once. They're actually showing up on time for meals, which never happened before." Cade paused. "You can ease up. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. Nothing fancy required? Just good food." "I can do fancy if you want it, sir. I don't want it." His voice was sharp, cutting. "I want you to do the job without killing yourself. Understood?" Sarah nodded, confused by his anger. Was he angry at her? At himself? She couldn't tell. Cade turned to leave, then stopped. "I heard about what happened in town yesterday, with Mrs. Reed." Sarah's stomach dropped. Here it came. The dismissal. The explanation that she was too much trouble, that the gossip wasn't worth a good cook. "I don't care what she said," Cade continued, "or what anyone says. You work for me. You live on my land. That means you're under my protection. If anyone bothers you again, you tell me, or tell Marcus. We'll handle it." He left before Sarah could respond, the door swinging shut behind him. She stood in the empty kitchen, stunned, under his protection. The words echoed in her head, strange and powerful. No one had protected her since David died. No one had stood between her and the cruelty of the world. Cade Blackwood barely knew her, clearly didn't want to know her, but he'd just drawn a line in the sand, claiming her as one of his people. It was more than Sarah had dared to hope for. That afternoon, Cade found himself doing something he hadn't done in 3 years. He rode into Silver Creek not because he needed anything, but because he had a purpose, a message to deliver. He went straight to the bank where Victor Reed kept his office. The receptionist tried to make him wait, but Cade walked past her without a word, pushed open Reed's door, and entered like he owned the place. Reed looked up from his desk, surprise quickly masked by a politician's smile. "Mr. Blackwood, what an unexpected pleasure. Please sit." "I'll stand." Cade remained by the door, his broad frame blocking any exit. "I'm here about Sarah Bennett." Reed's smile faltered slightly. "Ah, I heard you'd hired her. Very charitable of you." "It's not charity. She's my cook, and a damn good one. But I understand you've been spreading talk about the arrangement, and your wife has been harassing Mrs. Bennett in town. I assure you, any talk is just natural community concern. A woman of questionable virtue living at a bachelor's ranch." "Stop." Cade's voice was cold enough to freeze water. "Mrs. Bennett is respectable. She works hard. She takes care of her son. There is nothing questionable about her. And if I hear that you or your wife have bothered her again, we're going to have a problem." Reed leaned back in his chair, his mask slipping to show calculation underneath. "Mr. Blackwood, surely you understand my position. Mrs. Bennett owes me money, a substantial sum. I have every right to pursue collection." "She's paying you back. She has employment now. At $30 a month it would take her years to repay what she owes. I'm afraid I can't wait that long." Reed spread his hands. Business is business. Cade stared at him for a long moment. Something about this didn't sit right. Reed was too eager, too focused on Sarah specifically. There were dozens of people in Silver Creek who owed him money. Why pursue this one widow so aggressively? "How much does she owe?" Cade asked. $1,500. "Her husband borrowed $500. Even with interest, it shouldn't be anywhere near that." "There are penalty clauses in the contract. Quite legal, I assure you." If Mrs. Bennett had read the terms more carefully before her husband signed, Cade wanted to put his fist through Reed's smug face. But violence would only make things worse. Instead he said, "I'll pay it. The full $1,500. Today. In exchange you leave Mrs. Bennett alone. You don't speak to her. You don't approach her. You forget she exists." Reed's eyes lit up with greedy interest, but he shook his head. "I appreciate the offer, but the debt is Mrs. Bennett's. It wouldn't be proper for you to pay it. People might get the wrong idea about your relationship." There it was. The trap. If Cade paid off her debt, it would look like he was keeping her, like the gossip was true. But if he didn't pay it, Reed would keep harassing her, might even try to foreclose despite her having employment now. Cade realized in that moment that he was being played. Reed wanted something more than money. He wanted Sarah's land or her silence, or both. And he was using social pressure as a weapon, counting on Cade's isolation and reputation as a recluse to keep him from interfering. "You're right," Cade said slowly. "It wouldn't be proper. So here's what's going to happen instead. Mrs. Bennett will pay you back at the rate her employment allows, and you'll accept those payments without harassment, without pressure, and without involving your wife or anyone else in Silver Creek. Because if you don't, I'll make it my business to look into every loan you've made in the past 5 years, every contract, every foreclosure, and I'll bring in lawyers from Helena to do it. Territorial lawyers who don't owe you any favors." Reed's smile vanished completely. "That sounds like a threat, Mr. Blackwood." "It's a promise. Leave my people alone or I'll take you apart piece by piece. I have the money and the time. Do you really want to find out if I'm bluffing?" For a long moment they stared at each other across the desk. Then Reed inclined his head slightly. "I'll accept monthly payments, for now. But if Mrs. Bennett falls behind even once, all bets are off." "She won't fall behind." Cade left the bank feeling unsettled. He'd won this round, but he sensed there was a larger game being played that he didn't understand yet. Reed was too confident, too unconcerned by the threats. Either he was stupid, which Cade doubted, or he had something else planned. Whatever it was, Cade would need to stay alert, because he'd just made an enemy, and Victor Reed didn't strike him as the forgiving type. Back at the ranch, Sarah knew nothing of Cade's trip to town. She spent the afternoon teaching Tommy his letters in the cabin while a pot of stew simmered on the stove. It was peaceful, domestic, almost normal. For the first time in months, she let herself imagine a future beyond next week. Maybe they could stay here. Maybe Tommy could grow up on this ranch, learning from the Cowboys, becoming strong and capable. Maybe she could save money, actually pay off her debt, build a life that belonged to her instead of being constantly at someone else's mercy. It was a fragile hope built on nothing but 1 week of work and Cade Blackwood's grudging protection. But it was more than she'd had in so long. That evening, the week's trial period officially ended. Sarah served dinner cleaned up and waited anxiously in her cabin for word. Would Cade tell her to stay, or would Marcus appear to say she'd done well but wasn't needed anymore? At 8 o'clock, Marcus knocked on her door. Sarah's heart plummeted. This was it, the end. But Marcus was smiling. "Boss says you can stay. Permanent position, $35 a month." 35. Sarah blinked. "But you said 30. Boss raised it, said you've earned it. Also, he's giving you Sundays off. The men can fend for themselves 1 day a week." Sarah sat down hard on her bed, overwhelmed. "I don't understand. I thought he didn't want me here." "He didn't, but he wants good food and he wants his men happy. You provide both." Marcus tipped his hat. "Welcome to Blackwood Ranch, Mrs. Bennett, officially." After he left, Sarah pulled Tommy close and cried. Not from sadness this time, from relief so intense it felt like pain. They'd made it. They were safe, at least for now. And in his office, Cade Blackwood sat alone in the dark, wondering why keeping Sarah Bennett felt less like a business decision and more like a promise he hadn't known he was making. A promise to protect someone again, to let someone matter. It terrified him more than he'd ever admit. But Marcus was right about one thing. The ranch did feel different now. The men laughed more. The food was incredible. Even Cade had to admit he was sleeping better, eating better, functioning better. Sarah Bennett had walked onto his land with nothing but a pie and her dignity. And somehow, without meaning to, she'd started bringing his world back to life. Whether he wanted it or not. Whether he was ready or not. Change had come to Blackwood Ranch soft and steady as spring rain. And Cade Blackwood, for all his walls and isolation, was beginning to realize he couldn't hide from it forever. The question was whether he'd fight it or let it in. Only time would tell. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt almost like peace. Sarah rose before dawn each morning, her hands moving through familiar patterns of dough and batter, the kitchen filling with warmth and the scent of bread. Tommy grew braver, exploring the ranch under the watchful eyes of cowboys who'd begun to treat him like a little brother. And Cade Blackwood remained distant, but present, a silent force that shaped everything without ever quite touching it. Sarah learned to read the subtle signs of his approval, the way he'd pause outside the kitchen door on his way to the barn, breathing in the morning smells. The clean plates returned after every meal, nothing wasted. The fact that he hadn't fired her, hadn't complained, hadn't looked for reasons to send her away. It wasn't friendship, it wasn't warmth, but it was something, and Sarah had learned to be grateful for small mercies. On a Tuesday morning in late March, Sarah rode into Silver Creek with Marcus to collect supplies. The town looked the same as always, dusty and small, built around the single street that served as its spine. But something felt different. People watched her more carefully now. Whispers followed her into the general store. Sarah kept her head down, focused on her list. Flour, sugar, salt, dried beans. Simple staples that would stretch across the week's meals. Mr. Henderson filled her order with mechanical efficiency, his usual small talk notably absent. At the post office next door, Sarah overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. 2 men stood by the window, their voices carrying in the small space. One was a farmer she recognized from church, weathered and tired-looking. The other was younger, maybe 40, with the desperate edge of someone losing a fight. "Reed told me I got 2 weeks," the farmer was saying. 2 weeks to come up with the full amount or he takes the farm. But I already paid back 3/4 of what I borrowed. How's that fair?" "Nothing fair about it," the younger man replied bitterly. "He did the same to me last month. Suddenly there's all these extra fees and penalties I never knew about. Interest rates that doubled overnight. Now I owe twice what I borrowed, and he's threatening foreclosure. But that's got to be illegal. You want to hire a lawyer to fight the mayor who also owns the bank and sits on the county council. With what money?" The younger man laughed without humor. "We're trapped, John. All of us. Reed's got us by the throat and he knows it." Sarah moved closer, pretending to examine the wanted posters on the wall. Her heart hammered against her ribs. I heard Martha Pemberton lost her house last week, the farmer continued. Widow husband died just 6 months back. Reed said the loan came due immediately because of some clause in the contract. She had to move in with her sister and Helena left everything behind. Same thing happened to the Johnsons, and the Crawfords before them. The younger man's voice dropped lower. You know what I think. I think Reed's doing this on purpose. Targeting people who can't fight back. Widows, poor farmers, anyone without connections. And I think it's got something to do with the railroad. What railroad? Northern Pacific. There's been surveyors around for months. Word is they're planning a route through this area, which means they'll need land, which means someone who owns a lot of land in the right places is going to get very, very rich. The farmer was silent for a moment, processing. Then, you're saying Reed's stealing our land to sell to the railroad. I'm saying it's an awful convenient coincidence that every property he's foreclosed on in the last 6 months sits right where those survey stakes are. Sarah's hands had gone numb. Her own debt to Reed, the impossible $1,500, the penalty clauses she hadn't understood until it was too late. It wasn't just her. It was dozens of families all trapped in the same web, all being slowly strangled by a man who smiled and went to church every Sunday. She thought of Tommy safe at the ranch, thought of the cabin that was starting to feel like home, thought of what would happen if Reed decided $35 a month wasn't enough if he pushed for full payment despite Cade's protection. Marcus found her standing frozen by the post office wall, her face pale. Mrs. Bennett, you all right? I need to talk to Mr. Blackwood, Sarah said quietly. About Victor Reed, about what he's doing. They rode back to the ranch in silence, Sarah's mind churning. She'd been so focused on her own survival that she hadn't seen the larger pattern, but now it was clear, terrible in its scope. Reed wasn't just a cruel banker. He was running a systematic scheme to steal land from the most vulnerable people in Silver Creek, and nobody was stopping him because nobody could. He had all the power, all the connections, all the legal authority. Who could stand against a man like that? Back at the ranch, Marcus went to find Cade while Sarah mechanically began preparing lunch. Her hands moved through familiar motions, but her mind was elsewhere, cataloging everything she'd heard, everything she'd experienced, trying to piece together the full picture of Reed's operation. Cade appeared in the kitchen doorway an hour later, his face unreadable. Marcus said you needed to talk to me. About Reed. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and told him everything. The conversation she'd overheard. The pattern of foreclosures. The railroad rumors. The way Reed had targeted her, specifically demanding impossible sums with impossible deadlines. Cade listened without interrupting, his jaw growing tighter with each detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You're sure about the railroad connection?" he asked finally. "I'm sure there are surveyors. I'm sure Reed is foreclosing on properties along their route. I can't prove he's selling to them, but it's the only explanation that makes sense." Sarah hesitated. "Mr. Blackwood, I know this isn't your problem. I know you've already done more for me than I had any right to ask. But those people in town, they're losing everything, and nobody's helping them." "Because nobody can help them." Cade's voice was hard. "Reed owns this county. The sheriff works for him. The judge is his cousin. Even if someone wanted to fight, they'd lose before they started. So we just let him keep stealing, let him destroy families because it's too hard to stop him." Cade's eyes snapped to hers, sharp and angry. "I didn't say that. I said nobody can stop him. That doesn't mean nobody should try." "Then try. You have money. You have influence. People respect you even if they don't see you much." Sarah took a step closer, emboldened by desperation. "You could make a difference here. Or I could make things worse. Reed's the kind of man who strikes back when he's threatened. If I go after him, he'll come after everyone I care about. Which means you and Tommy would be targets. Have you thought about that?" Sarah had thought about it. But she'd also thought about Martha Pemberton losing her home, about the Johnsons and the Crawfords and all the others who'd been quietly crushed while everyone else looked away. "I'd rather be a target fighting for something right than safe while evil wins," she said quietly. Cade stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Then he turned and left without another word. Sarah returned to her cooking heart sinking. She'd pushed too hard, reminded him that getting involved meant risking pain, and Cade Blackwood had spent 3 years avoiding exactly that. But she'd underestimated him. That evening Cade rode to Helena and met with his lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Patterson, who'd handled his land deals for a decade. They talked for 3 hours in a private office, Cade laying out everything Sarah had told him, Patterson taking notes and asking pointed questions. When Cade returned to the ranch the next morning, he had a plan. Not a good plan, maybe, but a plan nonetheless. And for the first time in 3 years, he felt something besides numbness when he thought about the future. He felt purpose. 2 days later, Sarah was in the kitchen when Marcus brought her an envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with Cade's angular handwriting. "Bring your mortgage contract to my office, tonight after dinner." Sarah's hands shook as she folded the note. She'd kept the contract tucked in the bottom of her trunk, unable to look at it without feeling sick. But she retrieved it now, and that evening after the dishes were cleaned and Tommy was asleep. She knocked on Cade's office door. "Come in." The office was spare and masculine, all dark wood and leather. Cade sat behind his desk with Patterson beside him, papers spread across the surface. Both men stood as Sarah entered. "Mrs. Bennett," Patterson said with professional warmth, "thank you for bringing the contract. May I see it?" Sarah handed it over, watching as the lawyer examined it with a jeweler's eye. He made small sounds of interest, occasionally pointing things out to Cade in a low voice. Finally, he looked up. "This is exactly what I suspected," Patterson said. "Mrs. Bennett, do you see this clause here?" He pointed to tiny print in the margin, almost invisible. "This states that in the event of the borrower's death, the full loan amount becomes due immediately, plus penalties equal to 200% of the principal." "That's what Reed told me, but my husband didn't know it was there when he signed." "I'm certain he didn't, because this clause was added after the initial contract was drawn up. See the slightly different ink? The way it's crammed into the margin. This was inserted later, probably right before your husband signed in, a way that made it nearly impossible to notice." Patterson's voice was grim. "This is fraud, Mrs. Bennett, deliberate and calculated." Sarah's breath caught. "Can you prove it? With this contract alone?" "No. But if there are others like it, if Reed used the same tactic on multiple borrowers, then we have a pattern. And a pattern is something we can take to court." Cade leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. "Mrs. Bennett, I need to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. Can you get the other victims to trust you to share their contracts with you?" "I don't know. They're scared. Reed has so much power." "Tell them this." Cade's voice was firm, commanding. "Tell them I'm willing to fight Reed in court. I'll pay for the lawyers, I'll put my name behind the case, I'll do whatever it takes. But I need evidence. I need their contracts, their stories, proof that this isn't just one mistake, but a systematic operation. And if Reed finds out, if he comes after them before we can build the case, then they come here. All of them. I've got 5,000 acres and enough room to house 50 families if necessary. Reed can't touch them on my land." Cade paused. "But they have to be willing to stand up, to testify, to fight. I can provide the platform, but they have to be the ones who speak." Sarah looked at this man who'd spent 3 years hiding from the world, who'd hired her reluctantly and kept her at arm's length, who claimed not to care about anything beyond his ranch boundaries. And here he was, offering to take on the most powerful man in the county, to risk everything for people he didn't even know. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why are you doing this?" Cade was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "Because for 3 years I've been telling myself that the only way to avoid pain is to avoid caring, to avoid getting involved. But you were right the other day. Evil wins when good people stay silent. And I'm tired of being silent." He looked at her directly then, and Sarah saw something in his face that made her heart skip. Not romance, not yet, but connection, recognition, the acknowledgement that they were both broken people trying to figure out how to be whole again. "I'll talk to them," Sarah said. "I'll get the contracts." Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah became a quiet revolutionary. She visited the farms and homes of Reed's victims, always with Marcus as escort, always careful not to be seen. She talked to widows and struggling farmers, shared her own story, showed them her contract, and slowly, cautiously, they began to trust her. The Johnsons brought their mortgage papers. The Crawfords had theirs. Martha Pemberton, living with her sister and Helena, sent hers by mail. One by one the evidence accumulated. 8 contracts, 10, 12. Each one showing the same fraudulent clause, the same cramped writing in the margins, the same trap that Reed had set with deliberate malice. Patterson reviewed each document with meticulous care, building a case that grew stronger with every addition. By the 3rd week, he was confident enough to approach the territorial prosecutor in Helena. But Reed wasn't blind. He had eyes throughout Silver Creek people who owed him money or favors or fear. And he'd noticed patterns. Sarah Bennett visiting farms, families whispering in corners, a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. On a Sunday morning when the town gathered for church, Reed made his move. Sarah had decided to attend services for the first time since starting at the ranch. She wanted to show the other victims that she wasn't hiding, that they didn't need to be ashamed. Marcus accompanied her and Tommy, the 3 of them slipping into a back pew as Pastor Williams began his sermon. The service proceeded normally until the final announcements. Pastor Williams stood at the pulpit looking uncomfortable and cleared his throat. Before we close, Mayor Reed has asked to address the congregation about a serious matter. Reed stood, his expensive suit perfectly pressed his face, a mask of concerned righteousness. Thank you, Pastor. Friends, I'm sorry to bring unpleasant business into our Lord's house, but I feel I must speak. There have been accusations made against me regarding my banking practices, serious accusations, false accusations. He paused, letting the words sink in. Heads turned. People whispered. Sarah felt eyes sliding toward her. Mrs. Sarah Bennett, who some of you know is currently employed at Blackwood Ranch, has been spreading malicious lies about me. She claims I defrauded her husband, that I deliberately cheated her. This is completely untrue. Reed's voice was smooth-pained. I understand Mrs. Bennett is in a difficult situation. Widowhood is hard, but making false accusations against those who tried to help her is not the answer. Sarah's face burned. Tommy gripped her hand tightly. Around them the congregation murmured, some sympathetic to Reed, others uncertain. Furthermore, Reed continued, I'm concerned about Mrs. Bennett's current living arrangement. She resides at Blackwood Ranch alone with Mr. Blackwood, a wealthy bachelor. I don't wish to impugn anyone's character, but such arrangements raise questions about propriety, about whether Mrs. Bennett might be using her situation to manipulate Mr. Blackwood into supporting these baseless accusations against me. The murmurs grew louder. Sarah felt the weight of judgment pressing down from all sides. She wanted to stand up to defend herself, to scream the truth, but her voice was frozen in her throat. Then a different voice cut through the noise. Marcus Holt, standing in the back pew, his face hard as granite. Mayor Reed, I suggest you be very careful about what you're implying. Mrs. Bennett is a respectable woman doing respectable work. She has her own cabin. She's never been alone with Mr. Blackwood in any improper way. And if you continue to slander her character in public, you'll answer to him directly. Reed's smile was cold. Mr. Holt, I appreciate your loyalty to your employer, but surely you can see how this looks. A desperate widow, a wealthy man, convenient accusations against someone who stands in their way. The only thing convenient here is how you're trying to destroy Mrs. Bennett's reputation before she can expose what you've done. Marcus took a step forward. And for your information, she's not alone in her accusations. There are others, lots of others, and they're all going to speak. The church erupted in shocked conversation. Reed's mask slipped for just a moment, showing calculation and anger beneath. Then it snapped back into place. If there are legitimate concerns, I'm happy to address them through proper legal channels, Reed said smoothly. But this kind of gossip and slander in the Lord's house is inappropriate. Pastor Williams, I think we should adjourn. The pastor, looking miserable, quickly pronounced the benediction. The congregation filed out in buzzing groups, already spreading the story, already taking sides. Sarah pushed through the crowd with Tommy Marcus clearing a path. Outside, she gulped air, feeling like she was drowning. Reed had just poisoned the whole town against her, made her look like a liar and a manipulator. Even people who might have believed her would now have doubts. "That bastard," Marcus said under his breath. He knew exactly what he was doing. "He's destroying my credibility before we can even bring the case," Sarah whispered. "Who's going to believe me now? Boss will, and the territorial prosecutor in Helena doesn't care what Silver Creek thinks." Marcus touched her shoulder gently. "Come on, let's get back to the ranch. You'll be safe there." But Sarah didn't feel safe. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a deer cornered by wolves. Reed had just declared war, and she was terrified of what he'd do next. At the ranch, Cade was waiting. Marcus must have sent someone ahead because he was standing on the porch when they arrived, his face dark with fury. "Tell me exactly what Reed said," he commanded. Sarah recounted the church scene, her voice shaking. Cade listened in silence, his hands clenched into fists, his whole body radiating barely controlled anger. When she finished, he turned to Marcus. "Get the men, all of them, meeting in the barn in 10 minutes. Boss, now." Marcus hurried off. Cade looked at Sarah, and for the first time since she'd known him, his face was completely open. No walls, no distance, just raw, protective fury. "Reed made a mistake today," Cade said quietly. "He went after someone under my protection. In public, in church. He thinks he can intimidate you into silence." A cold smile touched his lips. "He's about to learn otherwise." 20 minutes later, every cowboy on Blackwood Ranch stood in the barn listening as Cade laid out the situation. Reed's fraud, the systematic cheating of vulnerable families, the railroad land grab, and now the public attack on Sarah's character. "I'm going to take Reed down," Cade told his men. "I'm going to expose what he's done and make sure he pays for it. But that means this ranch is going to be in the middle of a war. Reed will strike back. He'll try to hurt us economically, socially, maybe even physically. Anyone who wants to leave, no hard feelings. Anyone who stays, you're in this fight with me. What's it going to be?" The cowboys looked at each other. Then Henry Nash, the youngest, stepped forward. "Boss, Mrs. Bennett makes the best food I've ever eaten. If Reed's trying to hurt her, he's trying to hurt all of us. I'm in." "Me too," said another. "And me." One by one, every man pledged his support. Sarah, watching from the doorway with Tommy, felt tears streaming down her face. These men barely knew her, but they were willing to fight for her because it was right, because Cade Blackwood had asked them to, because somewhere along the way she'd become one of them. That night, Cade called Sarah to his office again. Patterson was there along with Marcus and Sheriff Grant, a surprise addition who'd ridden out from town after hearing about the church incident. "Mrs. Bennett," the sheriff said awkwardly, "I need to apologize. I've known for a while that Reed was playing fast and loose with his loans, but he's my boss in a way, pays my salary through the county council. I looked the other way because it was easier. And now," Sarah asked, not sure whether to trust him, "now he crossed a line, attacking a woman in church, trying to ruin her reputation to cover his crimes. That's not law, that's tyranny." Grant met her eyes. "I'm willing to testify to what I know. It's not much, but it might help." Patterson nodded slowly. "It would help. A sheriff's testimony carries weight even in territorial court." "There's one more thing," Grant said. "Reed's getting nervous. I heard him talking to his clerk Daniel Ross about making sure certain documents were secured, hidden. I think he knows something's coming." "Then we need to move fast," Cade said. "File the complaint this week. Get it on record before Reed can destroy evidence." They talked for another hour, planning strategy, discussing risks. When the meeting finally broke up, Sarah found herself alone with Cade for the first time in weeks. "Thank you," she said simply, "for all of this, for believing me, for fighting." Cade looked at her, really looked at her, and Sarah saw exhaustion in his face, but also something lighter, something like hope. "3 years ago, my wife made me promise something before I left for the war," he said quietly. She made me promise that if she wasn't there when I got back, I wouldn't stop living. I'd keep going. I'd find reasons to care. His voice roughened. I broke that promise. For 3 years I've been dead inside. But you and Tommy, you started waking me up. And this fight with Reed, it's giving me something I haven't had in a long time. What's that? A reason to give a damn. Cade smiled, sad and genuine. So thank you, Mrs. Bennett. You might have saved me as much as I'm trying to save you. Before Sarah could respond, before she could process the weight of what he'd just shared, footsteps pounded across the yard. Marcus burst through the office door, his face pale. "Boss, Tommy's gone." The world stopped. Sarah couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "What do you mean, gone?" "He was playing near the barn an hour ago. Dutch was watching him. Then Dutch got called away for just 5 minutes, and when he came back, Tommy was gone. We've searched everywhere." "He wouldn't just wander off," Sarah said, panic rising. "He knows the rules. He wouldn't—" She stopped, because on the desk pinned under a rock was a note that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. Someone had come into Cade's office while they were distracted and left it. Cade unfolded the paper with steady hands, though his face had gone white. He read it once, then handed it to Sarah without a word. The message was short and brutal. "Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Bennett, the boy is safe for now. If you want him to stay that way, drop your case against me. You have 24 hours. Victor Reed." Sarah's legs gave out. She would have fallen if Cade hadn't caught her, holding her upright with hands that shook with suppressed fury. "He took my son," Sarah whispered. "He took my baby." "We'll get him back," Cade said, his voice hard as iron. "Marcus, round up every man. Bring weapons. Patterson, get Sheriff Grant back here now. We're going after Reed tonight." "Boss, if we do this wrong, he might hurt the boy," Marcus warned. "And if we do nothing, he'll keep him as leverage forever. No." Cade's eyes were chips of frozen fury. Reed made his final mistake when he took that child. Now he's going to learn what happens when you threaten what's mine. Within an hour, 15 armed cowboys stood ready in the ranch yard. Sheriff Grant had returned with 2 deputies who were loyal to him rather than Reed. Patterson had sent word to the territorial prosecutor in Helena, though help from there would take at least 2 days to arrive. They didn't have 2 days. They had hours. "Reed will keep Tommy somewhere he controls," Cade said, thinking aloud. "His house would be too obvious. His bank has too many windows, too many witnesses. But he owns a warehouse on the edge of town, old lumber storage. That's where I'd keep someone if I wanted to hide them." "Then that's where we start," Sheriff Grant said. They rode in darkness, a small army moving through the night. Sarah insisted on coming despite Cade's protests. Tommy was her son. She'd face whatever danger came. The warehouse sat isolated on Silver Creek's outskirts, a hulking shadow against the star-scattered sky. Lights burned in one corner window. Someone was there. Cade divided his men, sending half to cover the back while he, Marcus, Sarah, and Sheriff Grant approached the front. They moved in silence, weapons ready, hearts pounding. The front door was unlocked. Careless, or a trap. Inside the warehouse stretched dark and cavernous, filled with old lumber and dusty equipment. The light came from an office in the corner, and voices drifted from within. Reed's voice, smooth and unconcerned, and another voice, younger, nervous. Daniel Ross, his clerk. Cade motioned for the others to wait, then moved closer to listen. "How long do we keep the boy?" Ross was asking. "Until Blackwood and that Bennett woman see reason. A few days at most." Reed sounded relaxed, like he was discussing a business transaction. "Parents always break when their children are involved. But what if they don't? What if they call in territorial authorities? They won't, because they know I'll make it look like the boy ran away. Tragic accident. Happens all the time in frontier country." Reed's voice turned cold. "I've worked too hard building this railroad deal to let one mouthy widow and a reclusive rancher destroy it. If they won't be reasonable, they'll learn harsh lessons." Cade had heard enough. He straightened and walked directly toward the office, no longer trying to hide. Behind him, his men flooded into the warehouse surrounding the building. Reed looked up as Cade appeared in the doorway, surprise flashing across his face before his mask snapped into place. "Mr. Blackwood, this is unexpected and illegal. You're trespassing." "Where's the boy?" Cade's voice was deadly calm. "I don't know what you're talking about." "The note was in your handwriting, Reed. The threats were yours. Now where is Tommy Bennett?" Reed stood slowly, his hand moving toward the desk drawer. But Marcus was faster, crossing the room in 3 strides and slamming Reed's arm down on the wood hard enough to make him cry out. "Don't," Marcus said pleasantly. "Whatever you're reaching for, don't." Sheriff Grant entered behind Cade, his badge glinting in the lamplight. "Victor Reed, I'm placing you under arrest for kidnapping, extortion, and fraud." "This is absurd," Reed sputtered. "You have no proof, no evidence. This is just Blackwood trying to intimidate me." "Actually," said a new voice, and Daniel Ross stood up from his corner, his face pale but determined. "I have all the proof you need." Everyone turned to stare at the clerk. Ross pulled a leather satchel from under the desk and opened it, revealing ledgers and documents and what looked like 3 years' worth of carefully kept records. "I've been documenting everything," Ross said quietly. "Every fraudulent loan, every foreclosure, every payment you made to railroad company representatives, every bribe you paid to judges and officials. It's all here. Because I knew someday you'd throw me under the wagon to save yourself, and I wanted insurance." Reed's face had gone from red to white. "You little worm! I trusted you. You used me, just like you used everyone else." Ross handed the satchel to Sheriff Grant. "There's also a detailed log of tonight. How Reed ordered me to grab the Bennett boy while everyone was distracted, where we were supposed to keep him, what we were supposed to do if the parents didn't cooperate." He met Sarah's eyes. "The boy's in the back room. He's scared but unhurt. I made sure of that." Sarah ran before Grant finished taking the satchel. She tore through the warehouse to the back room Ross had indicated and found Tommy huddled in a corner, his face tear-streaked but brave. When he saw her, he launched himself into her arms. "Mama, I knew you'd come. I knew Mr. Blackwood would find me." Sarah held him so tight she couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, could only shake with relief and rage and love. Behind her she heard Cade's voice, heard the sounds of Reed being placed in chains, heard Marcus and the other cowboys securing the warehouse. They'd won. Tommy was safe. Reed was arrested. Justice for once was being served. But as Sarah carried her son out into the night air, as Cade appeared beside her with a look of fierce protectiveness, she knew this was only the beginning. The real battle would come in court, where Reed's lawyers and connections and money would try to twist the truth. Still, for tonight, it was enough. Her son was in her arms. Cade Blackwood stood beside her like a wall between her family and the darkness. And Victor Reed, for all his power and cruelty, was in chains. Sometimes justice came slowly, but when it came, it was sweet. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Tommy asleep against Sarah's chest, the cowboys riding in protective formation around them. Cade stayed close, his presence a silent promise that nothing would harm them on his watch. Back at the ranch, Sarah tucked Tommy into bed and sat beside him until his breathing deepened into real sleep. Then she went looking for Cade and found him on the porch, staring out at his land, at the mountains dark against the star-filled sky. "Thank you," she said for the second time that night. "For everything, for saving him, for not giving up." Cade turned to face her, and in the moonlight his expression was open, vulnerable, in a way she'd never seen. "Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time, "I need to tell you something." She waited, her heart beating faster. "When Ellen and Lucy died, I thought my life was over. Thought I'd never feel anything again except guilt and regret. I built these walls to keep the pain out, but they also kept everything else out. Joy, purpose, connection." He paused. "Then you showed up with that damn pie and your scared son and your dignity, and those walls started cracking. I fought it. God knows I tried. But you and Tommy, you brought light back into this place, into me." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Cade, Let me finish." His voice was rough. "Tonight, when I thought Tommy might be hurt, might be in danger because of me, because I'd made Reed my enemy. I felt fear like I haven't felt since the war. But I also felt something else. I felt alive, fighting for something that mattered, protecting someone I—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "Someone I care about. Both of you. I care about both of you." "We care about you too," Sarah whispered. "You've given us more than safety. You've given us hope, a future, a place where we belong." They stood there in the darkness, the space between them charged with possibility, with the beginning of something neither had expected to find. Cade reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused and steady. "This isn't over," he said. "Reed's arrest is just the start. There'll be a trial, probably months of legal fighting. He'll try to destroy both of us." "Then we'll fight together," Sarah said firmly. "That's what partners do." Cade smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Partners. I like that." They stood together under the stars, holding hands like teenagers, neither quite ready to push further, but both knowing they'd crossed some invisible line. The future stretched ahead, uncertain and challenging, and full of danger. But for the first time in 3 years, Cade Blackwood was looking forward instead of back. And Sarah Bennett, who'd walked onto this ranch with nothing but desperation and dignity, had found something she'd never thought possible. She'd found home. The dawn broke cold and clear over Silver Creek, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose. Sarah stood at her cabin window, watching the sunrise, and thinking about the day ahead. Today, the trial began. Today, Victor Reed would finally face justice for what he'd done. But justice, she was learning, was a complicated thing in Montana Territory. The territorial courthouse in Silver Creek was the largest building in town, built of gray stone that had been hauled from the mountains at great expense. It stood as a monument to law and order in a place where both were constantly threatened by the chaos of frontier life. This morning, it was packed to capacity. Every seat in the public gallery was filled. Cowboys from Blackwood Ranch sat in solid rows, their presence a physical declaration of loyalty. The families Reed had victimized clustered together, drawing strength from numbers. And scattered throughout were the townspeople of Silver Creek, some sympathetic, some merely curious, all eager to witness the spectacle. Judge Morrison had arrived from Helena the previous week, a territorial appointee with no connections to Reed or Silver Creek. He was a stern man in his 60s, his face carved from years of frontier, judging his reputation for fairness, legendary. That alone gave Sarah hope. Victor Reed sat at the defense table with 3 lawyers from Helena, expensive men in expensive suits who'd spent the past 2 weeks filing motions and objections and attempting to get the case dismissed. They'd failed. Judge Morrison had reviewed the evidence Patterson presented and declared there was more than enough for a trial. Now Reed looked smaller somehow, stripped of his mayoral authority, forced to sit in chains like a common criminal. But his eyes were still calculating, still confident. He believed he could win, believed his money and connections would save him. Sarah wasn't so sure. She'd learned the hard way that powerful men rarely paid for their crimes. Patterson called his first witness. The prosecution calls Mrs. Sarah Bennett. Sarah rose on shaking legs and walked to the witness stand. The courtroom felt enormous, every eye boring into her. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, then settled into the wooden chair and tried to breathe. Patterson was gentle in his questioning, walking her through the timeline of her husband's death, the loan Reed had made, the impossible debt that had suddenly appeared. He asked her to read from the contract, pointing out the hidden clause in cramped writing that transformed $500 borrowed dollars into $1,500 owed. "Mrs. Bennett," Patterson said, "when your husband signed this contract, did he understand this clause?" "No, sir. We read it together before he signed. That clause wasn't there. Or if it was written so small and so far in the margin that we couldn't see it." "And after your husband's death, when Mr. Reed demanded immediate payment, what did you do?" "I tried to negotiate, to get more time. I offered to work to pay in installments, but Mr. Reed said the contract was clear, full payment or foreclosure." Sarah's voice stayed steady, though her hands trembled in her lap. That's when I started asking questions, talking to other people who'd borrowed from him. And I discovered I wasn't alone. Dozens of families had been trapped the same way. Objection. Reed's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Harrington, rose smoothly. Hearsay, Your Honor. What others may or may not have experienced is not relevant to Mrs. Bennett's case. Your Honor, Patterson countered, we intend to demonstrate a pattern of fraudulent behavior. Mrs. Bennett's testimony establishes that pattern's existence. Other witnesses will corroborate the specifics. Judge Morrison considered. I'll allow it, but keep it focused, Mr. Patterson. Patterson smiled. Mrs. Bennett, you mentioned Mr. Reed's clerk, Daniel Ross. Did Mr. Ross ever discuss these contracts with you? Not directly, but I overheard him and Mr. Reed talking in the warehouse. Mr. Reed said he'd been running this scheme for 3 years, that he targeted widows and poor farmers because they couldn't fight back, that he was taking their land to sell to the railroad company. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked down hard. Order, I will have order in this court. Harrington was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, this is outrageous. Mrs. Bennett is testifying to alleged conversations she supposedly overheard while trespassing in my client's property. This is inadmissible. The warehouse incident involved the kidnapping of Mrs. Bennett's son, Patterson said calmly. She was there as part of a rescue operation sanctioned by Sheriff Grant. Her testimony about what she heard is entirely admissible. I'll allow it, Morrison ruled. Continue, Mr. Patterson. The questioning went on for another hour. Patterson was methodical, building a picture of Reed's systematic fraud piece by careful piece. When he finally said, "No further questions," Sarah felt wrung out, exhausted. Then Harrington stood for cross-examination, and Sarah understood the real battle was just beginning. Mrs. Bennett. Harrington said, his voice oily with false sympathy. You've been through a terrible ordeal. Losing your husband, facing financial difficulties, struggling to care for your son. I don't envy your situation. Sarah said nothing, waiting for the trap she knew was coming. In such desperate circumstances, might you have been willing to do anything to escape your debt, to find a protector, perhaps? Objection. Patterson was on his feet. Counsel is implying facts, not in evidence. I'm exploring Mrs. Bennett's motivations, Your Honor. The jury needs to understand whether her testimony is credible or if she has ulterior motives for attacking my client. Tread carefully, Mr. Harrington, Morrison warned. But I'll allow the question. Mrs. Bennett, you may answer. Sarah took a breath. I'm not willing to lie to escape debt. I'm willing to tell the truth even when it's hard, even when men like your client try to destroy my reputation for doing it. A flicker of anger crossed Harrington's face. You're currently employed by Mr. Cade Blackwood, correct? Yes. And you live on his ranch? I have a cabin there, yes. Separate from the main house, part of my employment arrangement. How convenient. A wealthy bachelor providing housing for an attractive widow, and now that same bachelor is financing this entire lawsuit against my client. Does that strike you as entirely proper? Sarah's hands clenched. She could feel Cade's rage from across the courtroom, could sense him wanting to stand up and defend her. But she held up one hand, slightly a signal. Let me handle this. Mr. Blackwood hired me because I can cook, Sarah said clearly. He's supporting this case because your client committed crimes against dozens of families and someone needed to stop him. If you want to insinuate something improper about our relationship, you're welcome to try. But you'll be lying just like Mr. Reed lied to all those families. Harrington's jaw tightened. Mrs. Bennett, you didn't answer my question. Isn't it true that you and Mr. Blackwood have formed a romantic attachment, that you're using his wealth and influence to pursue a vendetta against my client? What Mr. Blackwood and I may or may not feel for each other is none of your business, Sarah said, her voice sharp now. But I'll tell you what is your business. Your client stole from poor families. He drove widows from their homes. He kidnapped my 80-year-old son to silence me. Those are facts. My relationship status doesn't change facts. The courtroom was dead silent. Harrington stared at her for a moment, clearly trying to decide whether to push further. Then he said, "No further questions." Sarah descended from the stand feeling like she'd survived a battle. As she passed the defense table, Reed's eyes followed her cold and calculating. But there was something else there too, a flicker of uncertainty, because Sarah Bennett hadn't broken, hadn't cowered, had met his lawyer's attacks with strength. For the first time, Reed looked like a man who might actually lose. The prosecution called witness after witness over the next 2 days. Farmers testified about sudden foreclosures. Widows described impossible debts that appeared overnight. Each one brought their fraudulent contracts, and Patterson methodically demonstrated the pattern. The same hidden clauses, the same cramped writing, the same systematic theft. Sheriff Grant testified about Reed's threats about the culture of fear the mayor had cultivated. "I knew something was wrong." Grant admitted, his face heavy with shame. "But I was afraid to act. Reed controlled everything. The bank, the council, the law itself in this town. I convinced myself that if I just kept my head down, things would be bearable. I was wrong. Cowardice dressed up as pragmatism is still cowardice." His testimony was damning, but the real blow came on the 3rd day when Patterson called Daniel Ross to the stand. Ross looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. His face was gaunt, his hands shook, and when he raised his right hand to swear the oath, his voice cracked. But when Patterson asked him to describe Reed's operation, Ross's testimony was clear and devastating. "Mr. Reed instructed me to create what he called trap contracts," Ross said, staring at his hands. "We'd write the initial agreement normally with fair terms. Then right before the borrower signed, I'd add clauses in the margins. Tiny print, cramped writing placed where people wouldn't notice unless they were specifically looking. Mr. Reed said it had to be legal but hidden. A trap that wouldn't spring until we needed it to." "And when did you need it to spring?" Patterson asked. "When the Northern Pacific Railroad started surveying routes through Silver Creek. Mr. Reed knew they'd need land for the line, so he identified properties along the probable route and began forcing foreclosures. The borrowers thought they were paying off their loans normally, but we'd trigger the hidden clauses. Suddenly they owed 3 times what they'd borrowed. When they couldn't pay, we foreclosed and Mr. Reed took possession." "What did he do with the properties?" Ross pulled a ledger from the bag at his feet. "This shows every property Reed foreclosed in the past 3 years. 27 in total. 16 of them he sold directly to Northern Pacific representatives at 4 to 5 times what the original owners owed. The rest he's holding, waiting for the railroad route to be finalized." Patterson took the ledger and entered it into evidence. The courtroom buzzed with angry whispers. Judge Morrison had to use his gavel 3 times to restore order. "Mr. Ross," Patterson continued, "why did you help Mr. Reed do this? Why not speak up earlier?" "Because I was a coward," Ross said simply. "Mr. Reed paid me well, gave me a percentage of each foreclosure. I told myself I was just doing my job, that what the borrowers didn't know wouldn't hurt them. But it did hurt them. It destroyed them. And I helped." He looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes across the courtroom. "I'm particularly sorry for what we did to you, Mrs. Bennett, for taking your son. Mr. Reed ordered it, but I carried it out. I grabbed Tommy while everyone was distracted, told him I was taking him somewhere safe. The boy was terrified, and I did that. I'll never forgive myself." Harrington's cross-examination was brutal, attacking Ross's credibility, suggesting he was lying to avoid prison time, implying the documents were fabricated. But Ross didn't waver. He'd made his decision to tell the truth, and he stuck to it, even when Harrington tried to tear him apart. When Ross finally left the stand, pale and shaking, Sarah felt something shift in the courtroom. The jury's expressions had changed. Doubt had given way to certainty. Sympathy for Reed had transformed into disgust. But there was one more piece of evidence, one more twist that even Sarah hadn't known about. On the 4th day of trial, Patterson stood and said, "Your Honor, the prosecution has one final piece of evidence, something we discovered during our investigation that we believe demonstrates not just the scope of Mr. Reed's fraud, but his absolute consciousness of guilt." He held up a stack of papers covered in cramped handwriting. These are detailed notes taken by Mr. Ross during meetings with Northern Pacific Railroad representatives. Mr. Ross, suspecting his employer might betray him, kept meticulous records of every conversation, every transaction, every admission of guilt. These notes dated and witnessed capture Mr. Reed's scheme in his own words. Harrington shot to his feet. Objection. This is a recording made without my client's knowledge or consent. It's inadmissible. Montana Territory has no laws prohibiting such recordings, Patterson countered. And given that the conversation took place in Mr. Reed's business office during business hours, there was no reasonable expectation of privacy. The recording is admissible. Judge Morrison considered. This was new ground, legally uncertain, but after a long moment he said, "I'll allow it. But Mr. Harrington, you'll have the opportunity to challenge its authenticity during your case." Patterson opened the first page and read aloud, his voice steady and clear. Meeting notes, October 15th, 1878. Present. Victor Reed J. Hamilton, Northern Pacific Railroad. Reed stated, "Once we clear those remaining properties, you'll have a straight route through Silver Creek. Minimal acquisition costs, maximum profit." Patterson turned to the next page. Hamilton asked about the families being displaced. Reed responded, and I quote from my notes, "Taken care of. Legal foreclosures all documented. They'll be gone within 6 months. Some are already gone. The Bennett woman was particularly troublesome, but I've handled that." He continued reading through multiple pages of detailed notes, each one documenting Reed's conversations with railroad representatives, each one showing his calculated scheme to steal land and profit from the displacement of innocent families. When Patterson finally closed the notebook, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. The meticulous documentation left no room for doubt. Reed's face had gone from white to gray. Beside him, Harrington looked like a man who'd just watched his case collapse into dust. Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Harrington, do you wish to present a defense?" Harrington stood slowly. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a recess to consult with my client." Denied. We've already had 3 recesses today. Present your defense or rest your case. Harrington looked at Reed, some silent communication passing between them. Then Reed shook his head minutely. There was no defense. They both knew it. "The defense rests, Your Honor," Harrington said, defeat heavy in his voice. The trial moved to closing arguments. Harrington did his best arguing that Ross was lying, that the notes could have been fabricated, that circumstantial evidence wasn't proof. But his heart wasn't in it. The jury could tell. Patterson's closing was simple and devastating. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the testimony. You've seen the contracts. You've heard Mr. Reed's own voice admitting to systematic fraud. The evidence is overwhelming. Victor Reed stole from the most vulnerable people in this community. He destroyed families. He kidnapped a child. He corrupted the very institutions meant to protect us. And he did it all for money. For greed. Nothing more. I ask you to do what Mr. Reed never did. I ask you to deliver justice." The jury deliberated for 3 hours. Sarah spent that time in a small room with Cade and Tommy, unable to eat, unable to think about anything except those 12 people deciding her fate, deciding whether truth mattered, whether justice was possible. When the bailiff finally called them back to the courtroom, Sarah's legs barely carried her. She took her seat in the gallery, Tommy on one side and Cade on the other. Cade reached over and took her hand, holding it tight. A public declaration that he didn't care what anyone thought anymore. The jury foreman stood a weathered farmer named Jensen, who Reed had tried to foreclose on 6 months ago. "We, the jury, find the defendant Victor Reed guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy, kidnapping, theft." The courtroom exploded. Victims wept with relief. Cowboys cheered. Reed sat motionless, his face a mask of disbelief. Judge Morrison hammered his gavel until order was restored. "Mr. Reed," Morrison said, his voice hard as iron, "you have been found guilty of crimes that strike at the very heart of civilized society. You abused your position of trust. You preyed on the vulnerable. You corrupted the law for personal gain. I sentence you to 15 years in territorial prison." Furthermore, all your assets will be liquidated and used to compensate your victims. Any properties you foreclosed upon will be returned to their original owners. You are hereby stripped of your position as mayor and barred from holding public office in Montana Territory for life." Reed finally broke standing and shouting, "This is a travesty! Blackwood bought this jury. That Bennett woman seduced him, and together they orchestrated this fraud. I'm innocent. Remove him," Morrison ordered. "Bailiff, take Mr. Reed into custody." Reed was dragged from the courtroom, still shouting accusations and threats. But his voice faded quickly, swallowed by distance, and justice finally served. Judge Morrison turned his attention to Daniel Ross, who sat pale and trembling in the witness section. "Mr. Ross, you have also committed serious crimes. You participated in fraud conspiracy and the kidnapping of a child. These are not minor offenses." Ross stood, his voice barely audible. "I understand, Your Honor. However," Morrison continued, his tone softening slightly, "your full cooperation with this court, your testimony against Mr. Reed, your evident remorse, and the fact that you ensured the Bennett boy was not harmed have been noted. I sentence you to 5 years in territorial prison with the possibility of parole after 3 years contingent upon good behavior and continued cooperation with authorities." Ross nodded slowly, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you, Your Honor." He turned to Sarah across the courtroom. "Mrs. Bennett, I know sorry isn't enough, but I am, truly." Sarah met his eyes for a long moment. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement. Ross had made terrible choices, but he'd also made the right choice when it mattered most. She nodded once. The bailiff led Ross away, his shoulders slumped, but his step lighter than it had been in weeks. Outside the courthouse, Sarah stood in the afternoon sun and let herself cry. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief. It was over. Reed was going to prison. The families would get their homes back. Justice had actually happened. Cade stood beside her, one arm around her shoulders, the other holding Tommy's hand. They formed a small triangle of victory surrounded by cheering cowboys and grateful families who crowded close to thank them. Sheriff Grant approached, looking lighter than Sarah had ever seen him. "Mrs. Bennett, Mr. Blackwood, I owe you both an apology, for not acting sooner, for letting fear make me complicit." "You testified when it mattered," Cade said. "That took courage. Courage I should have had years ago." Grant looked at the crowd of freed families. "But at least it's done now. At least they're safe." Over the next 2 weeks, Silver Creek underwent a transformation. Properties were returned to their owners. Fraudulent debts were erased. Families who'd been scattered by foreclosure came home to find their houses waiting. The territorial government appointed a new mayor, a fair-minded merchant who'd been one of Reed's victims. And slowly, painfully, the town began to heal. But Sarah barely noticed the larger changes. She was too focused on the smaller, more personal shifts happening at Blackwood Ranch. Cade had become more present, more open. He joined the men for meals instead of eating alone. He laughed at their jokes. He spent evenings on the porch with Sarah talking about everything and nothing while Tommy played nearby. The walls he'd built so carefully were crumbling, and beneath them was a man learning to live again. One evening, 4 months after the trial, Cade asked Sarah to take a walk with him. They left Tommy with Marcus and wandered out past the barn into the meadow where wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the spring warmth. "I've been thinking," Cade said as they walked, "about what happens next, about the future." Sarah's heart beat faster. "What about it? When I hired you, I told myself it was just business, a cook I needed, nothing more. But that was a lie even then." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "Sarah, you changed everything. You and Tommy. You brought life back to this place, back to me. And I need to know if what I'm feeling is just gratitude or something more, because it feels like something more." Sarah looked up at him. This man who'd saved her when she had nothing, who'd fought for her when no one else would, who'd opened his heart despite the pain it risked. "What does it feel like? Like I want you to stay. Not as my cook, not as someone who works for me, but as my partner. In everything." Cade's voice was rough, uncertain. "I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a few months. And I know I'm not easy to live with. I've got ghosts and walls and a bad habit of shutting people out when I'm scared, but I'm asking anyway. Sarah Bennett, will you marry me?" The question hung in the air between them, huge and terrifying and perfect. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too. "I need to know something first," she said. "Do you love me, or do you just love not being alone anymore?" Cade reached out and cupped her face in his calloused hands. "I love you. I love how brave you are, how you stood up when everyone else would have stayed down. I love how you protect Tommy, how you made my ranch a home again. I love your laugh and your strength and the way you never apologize for taking up space." He paused. "I love you, Sarah. Not just the idea of you. You." "I love you too," Sarah whispered. "I have for weeks. Maybe since you first stood up for me against Reed. Maybe since you saved Tommy. I don't know when it started, but I know it's real. Is that a yes?" "It's a yes. But I need to ask Tommy first. He lost his father. This is a big change for him." "Then let's ask him together." They walked back to the ranch hand in hand, found Tommy in the barn with Marcus learning to braid rope. Cade called the boy over and they sat down together on a hay bale. "Tommy," Cade said seriously, "I want to marry your mother, but I need your permission first, because this doesn't just affect her, it affects you too. You'd be my son in every way that matters. I can't replace your father. I wouldn't try. But I can promise to protect you and your mother for the rest of my life, to be someone you can count on, if that's all right with you." Tommy looked between his mother and Cade, his young face solemn. Then he said, "Do you love Mama?" "Very much." "Do you promise to be nice to her? Not mean like some men are?" "I promise." "And can I still call you Cade? Not Papa?" "You can call me whatever feels right." Tommy thought for another moment, then nodded. "Okay. You can marry Mama. But you have to let me help with the wedding." Cade smiled, genuine and warm. "Deal." They married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Pastor Williams officiated, looking relieved to be part of something joyful after the ugliness of the trial. The cowboys served as groomsmen, uncomfortable in their Sunday suits. The women from town who'd been Reed's victims brought food and flowers, transforming the ranch yard into something beautiful. Tommy stood beside his mother during the vows, solemn and proud. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Tommy cheered louder than anyone. The reception lasted until sunset, filled with music and laughter and dancing. Sarah danced with Cade while cowboys played fiddles and harmonicas. She danced with Tommy. She danced with Marcus, who told her quietly that he was glad she'd come to Blackwood Ranch with that pie all those months ago. "You saved him," Marcus said. "Boss was dying by inches before you arrived. Now look at him." Sarah glanced over at Cade, who was teaching Tommy a rope trick, both of them laughing. "He saved me first. Fair trade, I think." As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Sarah stood on the porch of what was now her home and thought about the journey that had brought her here. Widowhood, poverty, desperation, a 12-mile walk with a pie and a prayer. And now this, a husband who loved her, a son who was thriving, a home that was truly hers, justice served, and a community healing. It wasn't a fairy tale. There would still be hard days. Money would be tight sometimes. The ranch demanded constant work, and Cade's ghosts would surface occasionally, moments when he retreated behind walls and Sarah would have to gently coax him back out. But they'd face all of it together. That was the promise they'd made, and Sarah believed in promises now. The years that followed were good ones, not easy, but good. The ranch prospered. Tommy grew tall and strong, learning ranching from Cade and book learning from Sarah. At 12, he could ride like a cowboy and do mathematics that put most adults to shame. He remained serious and thoughtful, but he laughed more now. Had friends among the ranch hands. Looked at Cade with the kind of trust that couldn't be forced. Sarah became known throughout the territory as a skilled herbalist and midwife, using knowledge she'd learned from her mother and expanded through careful study. Women rode for miles to seek her help with difficult pregnancies or stubborn ailments. She never charged what she could have, instead accepting payment in trade or simple gratitude. And Cade slowly but surely rejoined the world. He attended town meetings, served on the county council that replaced Reed's corrupt one, helped establish a school and a real courthouse, used his wealth and influence to protect the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. Together, Cade and Sarah made Blackwood Ranch into something more than just a cattle operation. It became a sanctuary, a place where people running from bad situations could find work and safety. Cowboys who'd been blacklisted elsewhere found second chances. Widows with nowhere to go discovered employment and dignity. The ranch hands included former prisoners recovering drunks and young men escaping abusive families. Cade gave them all the same deal: work hard, prove yourself, and you'll have a place here. "We're building something," he told Sarah one evening as they watched the sunset from their porch. "Not just a ranch, a family. The kind of family that's chosen instead of born. I think that's what Ellen would have wanted, what Lucy would have wanted, for me to use what I have to make the world a little less cruel." Sarah squeezed his hand. "You're a good man, Cade Blackwood." "I'm a man who got lucky, who had his life saved by a woman brave enough to walk 12 miles with a pie and refuse to stay invisible." He looked at her love evident in every line of his weathered face. "Best decision I never made was letting Marcus convince me to hire you." But the moment that truly closed the circle came 5 years after the trial on a cold November morning. Sarah was working in the kitchen preparing breakfast for the ranch hands when Marcus appeared with a young woman in tow. The woman was thin and exhausted, her clothes worn, her face carrying the desperate edge Sarah remembered so well from her own reflection years ago. She held a baby in her arms, maybe 6 months old, wrapped in a threadbare blanket. "Mrs. Blackwood," Marcus said gently, "this is Emily Carter. Her husband died 3 months ago in a mining accident. The company's trying to force her off her claim. She heard about how you and the boss helped people during the Reed trial. She's hoping for help." Sarah finished, looking at Emily and seeing herself 5 years younger, terrified, desperate, trying so hard to hold on to dignity when the world was determined to strip it away. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and crossed to Emily, taking the young woman's free hand in both of hers. "You're safe here. We'll figure this out. First you need food and rest. Then we'll talk about your situation and how to fix it. But you're safe, I promise." Emily's face crumpled with relief, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you. God, thank you. I didn't know where else to go." "You came to the right place." Sarah led her to a chair, handed her a cup of hot coffee, began assembling a plate of food. Over her shoulder she called to Marcus, "Get Cade. Tell him we need Patterson to look into mining company contracts, and make sure the cabin behind the barn is ready. Mrs. Carter will be staying with us." After Marcus left, Sarah sat across from Emily and studied her. "Let me tell you a story," she said quietly. 5 years ago, I was exactly where you are now, widowed, broke, desperate. I walked 12 miles to this ranch with nothing but a pie and hoped that someone might give me a chance." "What happened?" Emily asked. "Someone did. A good man who'd forgotten how to be good gave me work when he didn't want to, and that work became a home, and that home became a family." Sarah smiled. "The world's full of cruel people, but it's also full of good ones. You just found some. So eat, rest, let us help. That's what we do here." As Emily ate hungrily, Sarah returned to her cooking and thought about circles. How what goes around comes around. How she'd been saved and now could save others. How trauma could transform into purpose if you let it. That evening, Cade came to find her in the kitchen after dinner. "Marcus told me about Mrs. Carter, the mining company situation. Can we help her? Patterson's already looking into it. If the contracts are anything like Reed's loans, we'll find leverage." Cade pulled Sarah close, resting his chin on top of her head. "You keep bringing home strays." "I was a stray once. Seemed only fair to pay it forward." "Fair, brave, stubborn." Cade's voice was fond. "All the things I love about you." They stood together in the warm kitchen, surrounded by the sounds of ranch life continuing around them. Outside, Tommy was teaching Emily's baby to grab his finger, making silly faces until the infant laughed. Cowboys finished their evening chores. Horses moved in the barn. Life happened constant and ordinary and precious. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "Opening your life like this? Letting so many people in it would be easier to just focus on the ranch." "Easier isn't better. And no, I don't regret it. Every person we help reminds me why living matters, why connection matters." Cade kissed the top of her head. "Ellen told me once that the measure of a life wasn't what you accumulated but what you gave away. I didn't understand that when she said it, but I do now, thanks to you." Sarah turned in his arms to face him. "You gave me back my life. You gave Tommy a father. You gave us both a home. Whatever we manage to give others, it'll never match what you gave us." "Then I guess we're even." They smiled at each other, these two people who'd found each other through desperation and built something beautiful from broken pieces. Outside, the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the world in gold and shadow. Inside, Blackwood Ranch lamps were lit, dinner was shared, and a new family member was welcomed into safety. And somewhere in the territorial prison in Helena, Victor Reed sat in a cell and thought about the widow who'd destroyed him. Sarah Bennett, who'd been nothing when he tried to crush her, who'd had nothing except dignity and courage and a stubborn refusal to disappear quietly. He'd underestimated her, underestimated the power of truth spoken by someone with nothing left to lose, underestimated the strength that comes from finally standing up after a lifetime of being pushed down. It was a mistake he'd spend the next decade paying for. While Sarah Bennett Blackwood lived free and happy, building a legacy of compassion on the foundation of her own survival. Years later, when Tommy was grown and married with children of his own, when Cade's hair had gone silver and Sarah's face carried the beautiful lines of a life well lived, they would sit on that same porch and remember the day everything changed. "Tell us the story again, Grandma," the children would beg, "about the pie and the mean mayor and how Grandpa saved you." And Sarah would smile and tell them the truth. "Grandpa didn't save me, darlings. We saved each other. That's how it works when love is real. Nobody's a hero alone. We're all just people doing our best, hoping that someone will meet us halfway." "But you were brave," the children would insist. "You stood up to the bad man." "I was terrified, but I stood up anyway. That's what bravery is. Not the absence of fear, but acting despite it. Doing what's right even when it costs you everything. Speaking truth even when silence would be safer." And the children would nod solemnly, storing away the lessons. Learning that ordinary people could be extraordinary when circumstances demanded it. That courage wasn't reserved for soldiers or heroes, but was available to anyone willing to reach for it. That justice, while slow and imperfect, was still worth fighting for. That love could heal even the deepest wounds if you let it in. These were the lessons Cade and Sarah passed down, the legacy they built from the ashes of their separate traumas. And Blackwood Ranch stood as a monument to those lessons, a place where the broken could become whole, where the desperate could find hope, where the invisible could finally be seen. All because one widowed woman refused to disappear quietly. All because one grieving man remembered how to care. All because they found each other at exactly the moment when both needed saving most. Some stories end in tragedy, others in triumph. This one ended in transformation. In two people who learned that the opposite of loss isn't gain but connection, that the opposite of despair isn't happiness but purpose, that the opposite of loneliness isn't company but belonging. And as the sun set one final time over Blackwood Ranch, painting the Montana sky in shades of rose and gold, Sarah and Cade sat on their porch and watched their grandchildren play in the yard where Tommy had once drawn pictures in the dust, where cowboys had once been afraid to hope, where a woman with a pie and a dream had walked up to a door and knocked, not knowing that on the other side waited the rest of her life. "Worth it?" Cade asked quietly, taking her hand like he had 1,000 times before. "Every moment," Sarah replied. "Every fight, every tear, every risk, worth it all." And in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the family they'd built and the legacy they'd created, they sat together. Not because fate had decreed it, not because destiny had planned it, but because they'd chosen each other again and again in big moments and small ones until choice became commitment, became love, became life. That was their story. Not of a cowboy saving a widow, though that had happened. Not of justice finally prevailing, though that had too. But of two broken people learning that broken things can be mended, that wounds can heal, that the end of one life can be the beginning of another, better one. If you're brave enough to knock on the door, if you're strong enough to speak the truth, if you're willing to believe that sometimes, just sometimes, the world rewards courage instead of crushing it. And if you're lucky enough to find someone who'll meet you halfway, who'll fight beside you instead of for you, who'll see your worth when the world insists you have none. That was the story Sarah told her grandchildren. The story of a pie and a ranch and a woman who refused to stay invisible. The story of redemption earned and love found and justice served. The story of home,